Committee will come back to order. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, thank you for being here. Since we last spoke in appropriations on April 27th, Special Counsel John Durham delivered his report detailing intelligence activities and investigations arising out of the 2016 presidential campaign. When Mr. Durham presented here at the committee, I asked him these questions. He was able to answer me in yes or no answers. I'd ask you to do the same. Did the FBI have an adequate basis on which to launch Crossfire Hurricane?
My understanding is that Mr. Durham found that it did not have a proper basis to elevate it to a full investigation, but that he thought it was an assessment or a preliminary inquiry was appropriate.
Did the FBI fail to examine all available exculpatory evidence?
I think, well, do you say to examine it? Certainly, I think there were failures, significant failures, with respect to exculpatory information.
Did the FBI interview all key witnesses in Crossfire Hurricane?
I think Mr. Durham, found that they did not.
Did the FBI abuse its authority under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act?
Well, certainly there were violations that were totally unacceptable, and in my view, cannot be allowed to happen again.
As noted in the report, Crossfire Hurricane investigators had hoped the returns on the Carter Page FISA application would, quote, self-corroborate. Do FBI or DOJ guidelines permit investigators to submit uncorroborated allegations in a FISA application in the hopes that the returns will self-corroborate?
I've never heard of that concept.
Okay. Is Crossfire Hurricane the only time the FBI has violated the procedures for the FISA process?
Well, there are a lot of different procedures, but that's certainly not the only compliance incidents that we've had with respect to FISA.
Director, as I expressed to you upstairs, the American people are outraged, and just this week I had at a town hall constituents expressing outrage about the actions of those within your agency who have damaged the FBI's reputation and undermined the good work of the vast majority of hardworking men and women within your agency. But going down the list, you have the Biden family investigations, you have the anti-Catholic memo. By the way, you mentioned 5 individuals who contributed to the anti-Catholic memo in the Richmond field office. Are they still employed by the FBI?
I don't think I mentioned any specific individuals. I did say that this was a product by a single field office that we took action on immediately, and we have an inspection that's underway right now that's looking at how this happened and how we make sure it doesn't happen again.
So it's still possible that individuals will be fired as a result of your review?
Well, I don't want to predetermine or forecast where the review will go. We're going to look at everything from exactly how it happened and what went wrong, and then if there are appropriate steps to be taken, we will take whatever the appropriate steps are.
Okay, you have the violence against pro-life clinics, you have the investigation of parents speaking at school board meetings, you have the collusion with big tech. The FISA abuses of Section 702 is where I want to focus right now. As you know, Section 702 authorizes warrantless surveillance. It's supposed to be targeted toward foreigners abroad, but the surveillance sweeps in a large amount of Americans' communications, and the FBI routinely runs searches of Section 702 data looking for phone calls, emails, text messages of Americans, so-called backdoor searches. Depending on the year, FBI has conducted anywhere from 3.4 million in 2021 to 200,000 in 2022. Given this fact, do you honestly think it's fair to continue describing Section 702 as an authority targeted only at foreigners abroad?
I do.
It looks like a framework that enables the FBI to spy on countless Americans. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, I can't speak to what it looks like to certain people. I can tell you that it is an authority focused on foreigners overseas in the context of national security investigations. I would add to that the FBI's piece of that, the FBI only accesses, so everything we're talking about FBI related only goes to about 3% of the entire 702 collection. And then within that 3%, this is important now.
Okay, I have 30
It's important
seconds,
that people understand this. The FBI ends up only accessing content in like 1.5% of that. So
I
a
understand.
little context is appropriate.
Well, if you're conducting hundreds of thousands or even just hundreds of warrantless searches of Section 702 data for Americans' communications, it's clearly a domestic surveillance tool. And I would argue that I believe it does pose a real problem within the FBI's conduct toward Americans, and I speak for many when I say I think it poses a real problem for the reauthorization of FISA authority for your organization. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Wray, for being here. I am troubled by many of the statements and questions we've heard today that embrace conspiracy theories and disinformation. And with these comments, it appears that some of my colleagues are trying to sow division and score political points rather than conduct legitimate oversight of the actual actions and policies of the FBI. I, like many Americans, would rather Congress focus on doing the people's business and ensuring that the FBI is able to do its job and do it well within the bounds of our Constitution and laws. Now, one of the most serious issues facing American communities now is drug abuse, particularly opioids and fentanyl. And in your opening remarks, you mentioned the arrest of 31 U.S. citizens in Northeast Ohio just a couple weeks ago, most hailing from Marion, for drug trafficking. Can you just take a minute, because I have some other questions, to describe what the FBI is doing to end the scourge of fentanyl and what additional tools you might need from Congress?
So the FBI is attacking the scourge of fentanyl coming from the southwest border in particular in a variety of ways. One, we are using our organized crime task forces to target the supply, the cartels in particular. Two, we're using our Safe Streets task forces to go after the gangs that are principally responsible, violent gangs, for distributing a lot of this all over our streets. Third, we're targeting provider abuse, prescription, pill mills and things like that through our healthcare fraud authorities. Fourth, we have something called J-Code, which focuses on the trafficking of fentanyl on the dark web, which is a real problem, and we've had a number of very significant takedowns there. We're also doing things like engaging in outreach, raising awareness. We put out a video called Chasing the Dragon with DEA that has been showed at a lot of schools around the country. We're trying to work with the health community. So there's a lot of things that we're doing, but this is it's an epidemic. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's an overstatement, and it's something that requires all hands on deck.
Okay, and if there are things you think Congress can help you with, please submit that to us afterwards. Another major threat to our nation is domestic terrorism, and that's something you've spoken about repeatedly. Like many Americans, I find it unpatriotic and dangerous when members of Congress embrace dangerous conspiracy theories that undermine our federal law enforcement and ultimately our democracy. And I find it disingenuous for members of Congress to harangue the head of the FBI about people losing faith in the FBI when those same members have been trumpeting lies and conspiracy theories about the agency for months. Words matter, they have consequences. And when leaders lie or embrace disinformation, that's dangerous. In recent years, we've seen increasing threats and violence levied against public servants at all levels, including journalists, elected officials, election workers, doctors, nurses, school officials, teachers, librarians, and more. And what these public servants have in common is they became targets for threats and violence when they had the guts to stand up to lies and conspiracy theories promulgated by the former president and his allies. We've seen MAGA extremists, Fox News pundits, Russian internet trolls, and elected officials parrot conspiracy theories and use heated language to convince the American public without facts that dedicated public servants are dangerous enemies who should be feared. Most Americans understand that this is not legitimate political discourse and that this kind of overheated and fact-free rhetoric can in fact encourage political violence. It's not normal and it should not be part of American public life. So, Director Wray, you've repeatedly testified about the serious threat that domestic violence extremists present to Americans. And these are people who commit violent and criminal acts in furtherance of social or political goals, whether racial and ethnic motivation or anti-government motivation. Can you talk about the role that mistrust in government and disinformation and conspiracy theories play in the radicalization and recruitment of extremists?
Well, certainly there's a whole host of misconceptions that are out there about any number of institutions, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's the Supreme Court, or whether it's any number of other institutions, that in the environment that we're in, where there are people who increasingly channel their rage into violence, that causes a problem. You know, there is a right way under the First Amendment to express what you're angry about and who you're angry with, and we take that very seriously and view as part of our mission, not just to protect the American people, but to uphold the Constitution. But when those views are then turned into violence and threats of violence, then we got a problem, and then I think the FBI has to act.
Thank you. I see my time has expired, but I would seek unanimous consent to introduce into the record a press release from the U.S. Attorney's Office of the Northern District of Ohio entitled 31 Individuals Involved in a Drug Trafficking Organization in Marion County and Lorain County Indicted.
Without objection. Chair
Thank you.
recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you. Mr. Director, when we abandoned Afghanistan, we released about 5,000 terrorists from the Parowan detention facility. One of those terrorists showed up at Abbey Gate 10 days later and killed 13 U.S. Marines. Where are the other 5,000?
I don't know that I can tell you where all 5,000
Well,
of
let
them
me
are.
put it more simply. Have you encountered any here in the United States?
We have quite a few ongoing investigations into foreign terrorist-related subjects, whether they're Al-Qaeda related or ISIS related, that we're conducting as you and I are having this conversation, and certainly.
So have you encountered any from Parowan here in the United States?
Specifically, I'm not sure I can say that. Let me follow up and make sure if there's anything more I can provide you on that.
Well, meanwhile, we've had about 1.5 million known gotaways cross the border as this crisis has unfolded. Any estimate of how many among of those 5,000 among the 1.5 million known gotaways may be terrorists?
I know that we have seen an uptick, which is obviously concerning to me, and I can tell from your question, concerning to you, in KSTs, as we call them, known or suspected terrorists coming across the southwest border. And our folks are working very hard to try to do our part to try to keep tabs on those individuals.
Speaking of upticks, have we seen an uptick in criminal cartel or cartel-related gang activity in the United States over the last several years?
Yes, the cartels working in kind of an unholy alliance with dangerous violent gangs here in the U.S. are responsible not just for the abominable distribution of fentanyl all over the country, but also an awful lot of the violence that comes along with it.
And that's coming principally across our southern border?
That's a huge driver of it, certainly.
Huge driver. It's reported we've lost contact with the guardians of more than 85,000 unaccompanied minors who've been brought here by the cartels through the southern border. How many of these children are still unaccounted for?
That I'm not sure. We have the answer to that. That may be a question for DHS.
What's the Woods procedure?
The Woods procedure is a procedure has nothing to do with 702. It has to do with traditional FISA, Title I FISA as we call it, and involves having files that have all the underlying documents to support each of the factual assertions in the application.
Is that important to the integrity of FISA applications?
Yes, sir.
In February of 2020, you assured the committee that you took these FISA abuses seriously, that you were working to address them. A year and a half later, the Office of the Inspector General reported that you weren't. They reported systemic noncompliance and essentially that some FBI field personnel took the Woods procedure as a joke. If we can't trust your past reforms, how seriously should we take your promises of future reform?
I appreciate the opportunity to address this one. So that OIG finding actually applies to, number one, that applies to compliance problems that occurred before all the fixes that I was testifying to you all about. Even though the report came out later, it was covering a time period that predated all of the fixes and reforms we put in place.
Your general counsel assured Mr. Durham that the abuses would not have happened because of the new procedures for supervisorial review, yet some of the worst abuses in Crossfire Hurricane were committed by supervisory agents. So why should we have any great confidence that's not going to happen again?
There are a couple different sets of reforms here. So the first is on the reforms that we put in place in response to the Inspector General's Crossfire Hurricane report.
But we can't trust your supervisors is the problem. The problem seems to be that this power exists at all, and human beings, being what they are, will tend to abuse them. Could you describe the term parallel construction as it relates to evidence produced in FISA searches?
Parallel construction? I'm not sure I've used that
Doesn't
term
that refer to
before.
the FBI using forbidden information from a 702 search to alert local law enforcement to search for and then produce the same material without revealing that it came from an improper search?
I'm just not sure about the use of the term.
Well, has the FBI ever employed that particular tactic in prosecuting American citizens?
Not to my knowledge, but again, I can look into that and get back to you.
What percentage of FISA warrant applications are rejected by the FISA court?
I don't know that we have that number. There's usually a back and forth with the court. It's not unusual for the court to...
It's a fraction of percentage, isn't it?
A fraction of a percentage?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if that's right, but it's definitely a small number. And I think that's partly because our folks learn over time what the court expects.
Which makes that sound an awful lot like a rubber stamp. I see my time's expired. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, Director Wray. Thank you for coming before the Judiciary Committee this afternoon, and I have read your testimony. I want to redirect this questioning for a moment, and I want to focus on the important work that the FBI is tasked with when it continues to do its work with gun violence prevention and keeping our communities safe. As of today, there have been over 300 mass shootings. That's more than the number of days that we have in this year. And statistics will continue to show us over and over again that during the summer, these numbers continue to rise. Extreme risk protection orders play an important role in law enforcement's response to preventing mass shootings from happening. And what are also known as red flag laws or orders, they empower law enforcement, along with family members and household members, to petition a court to actually have an individual that appears to be in crisis have those firearms just temporarily taken away or removed from them with a court order to be returned during expiration of that order. I have a few questions for you, so if you can answer as directly as you can, I appreciate it. Family members and members of law enforcement can often identify individuals who would pose a risk to themselves or to others within the community when they actually possess a gun. As the head of the United States Federal Law Enforcement Agency, do you believe that these red flag laws and these programs enhance public safety?
I don't want to speak on behalf of any specific legislative proposal, but I will say that I know from experience that a number of states have had good experiences with those laws.
Thank you. And in the past several years, several states have actually enacted those extreme risk protection orders. In total, we actually have 21 states, and the District of Columbia have enacted their own forms of red flag laws. If a person who is subject to such an order tries to buy a gun from a federally licensed firearm dealer, would the FBI approve or deny the sale?
Well, I believe if the order is required by state law, making it a state prohibitor, and therefore is loaded into the NICS system, then when the background check is run, when the FFL, the federal firearms licensee, contacts NICS to proceed with the sale, that would pick up the so-called the order that you're talking about, and if that's a prohibitor, then that would block the transaction, is my understanding.
So in the absence of an application or applicable state law, is there a way for the FBI agent to seek an order under federal law?
I'm not aware of any federal law to that effect.
Exactly. If an FBI agent has information that someone has been violent many times in the past, but is not able to seek a criminal conviction, is there a way for the FBI to deny the sale of a gun to that person?
We only deny sales for people who are prohibited by law from possessing firearms.
My bill, the Federal Extreme Risk Protection Order Act, which was passed by the House last Congress, would provide Americans in all states access to these truly life-saving measures. I have reintroduced this bill again this term. Last summer, Congress also passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Among other critical gun violence provisions in that, the legislation begins to address the problem of gun trafficking. What steps has the FBI taken to implement or utilize this new law that actually helps to stop gun trafficking?
Well, we're of course working closely with the Justice Department to implement all the provisions of the law that relate to NICS in particular. The place has had the biggest impact on us is certainly on the additional checks that now would be run for the 18 to 20-year-olds. And we started implementing that last October. It was fully implemented starting in January. And it's a big change for us and for the state agencies that are on the receiving end of the request for information, as well as for the FFLs, both the big stores and the mom and pops. It's a big change in the system. I think we've done about 100,000 or so checks of this 18 to 20, in other words, U21 group that we're talking about since the implementation of the act. Those are not all denials, to be clear. In fact, the vast majority of them were sales that appropriately proceeded. But there were some that were, of course, denials based on the statute.
Thank you so much. I'm out of time.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank the chairman. Thank you, Director Wray, for appearing. Brian Auten was one of the FBI intelligence analysts who interviewed Igor Danchenko, the principal source of the Steele dossier, in January 2017, correct?
I believe that's in the Durham report.
And Danchenko explained that the dossier allegations were BS, yet the FBI did not reveal that to the FISA court. Instead, the FBI continued to use those allegations in 2 more sworn FISA applications about President Trump and Putin, correct?
Well, again, I want to let Mr. Durham's report speak for itself.
Okay, but as director of the FBI, those are the facts of the FBI under your watch. The FBI conducted...
No, sir, I'm sorry. It's important. Not under my watch. Those are the facts.
I'm getting to the part under your watch.
Okay.
The FBI conducted an internal investigation of Auten and sought to suspend him, but Auten appealed, correct?
I can't discuss a specific pending personnel matter.
Okay, well, according to recent reports, those are the facts. Nevertheless, in 2020, after Senators Grassley and Johnson highlighted evidence of potential financial crimes and corruption against the Biden family, the FBI assigned Auten to compile an assessment which was used to characterize the Biden revelations as Russian disinformation. The evidence Grassley and Johnson had collected were mostly financial records and could easily have been corroborated as authentic. And by then, the FBI had the Hunter laptop in its possession for over a year, so it knew the lucrative payments of the Bidens from corrupt and anti-American regimes were authentic. How on earth did the FBI empower an agent under investigation for potentially corrupt performance and abuse of FISA in one politically fraught investigation, a Democrat operative-driven case against President Trump, to play a key role and to undermine a second politically fraught investigation, a case against the Bidens? How's that possible? How can you allow that to occur in the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as my colleagues on the other side of the aisle say, the elite law enforcement agency of the United States? How does that occur?
I can't, at the moment, discuss a pending personnel matter. I can tell you that every employee who in any way touched the Crossfire Hurricane matter has been referred to our Office of Professional Responsibility, our disciplinary
Are you
arm.
concerned about this activity by the FBI and what was communicated to the FISA court? Does that concern you as the director of the FBI?
I consider the conduct that was described in the Durham report as totally unacceptable and unrepresentative of what I see from the FBI every day and must never be allowed to happen again.
And have there been consequences as a result? Is Mr. Auten, has he had consequences?
Well, again, I can't speak to pending personnel matters. As you would perhaps remember from your own time in law enforcement, because we were working closely with Mr. Durham and I assigned agents to help him, at his request, we slowed down the administrative process to allow his investigation to complete itself. Now that it is complete, our personnel processes are very much ongoing.
Well, I think it is more than troubling that under your watch, we see that this continued to occur and you have Auten being continued to be empowered after there was an investigation and after there was an effort by the FBI to look into why he would go to the FISA court and give wrong information. I mean, the issue here has been wrapped up in a cloud of politics, but the fact is the American people deserve to know how the FISA court is being abused and how it's being abused against the former president and against them. In light of the reports that we saw Mr. Johnson from Louisiana put forward, that was in a court filing and a court report. I want to move on to another topic. On September 23rd, 2022, 20 heavily armed agents stormed the home of Mark Houck. You're familiar with this?
I'm familiar with the Houck case a little bit, yes.
And this was after Mr. Houck's lawyer reached out and said he would appear voluntarily because the incident in question occurred almost a year earlier in October of 2021, so a year earlier. And the question here I have, local authorities investigated the incident but concluded there was no case. After the jury met for roughly an hour, Houck was acquitted. How on earth did Mark Houck end up having the FBI send several armed agents along with local authorities to arrest him at gunpoint? And do you approve it? Did you approve of that?
Well, let me start where you ended. Decisions about the manner of an arrest are not something that the FBI director approves. I defer to and rely on the judgment of the experienced career agents on the ground who have both the most intimate understanding of the facts and of the training experience to decide how best to effectuate an arrest.
Do you know who did order it?
And my understanding is that that arrest was conducted in our Philadelphia division by career agents with a combined 40 years of FBI experience.
Do you approve of the raid now in retrospect? Do you think it was appropriate? Do you think it was appropriate for a father to have armed FBI agents along with local agents go to his home, arrest him at gunpoint for alleged violation of the FACE Act a year after the alleged incident, after the father had said through his lawyer that he would appear voluntarily? Do you believe that FBI agents should go to the home of a father in Philadelphia suburbs?
I'm not going to second guess the judgment of the career agents on the ground who made the determination.
But your job is to second guess and look at what they are doing. Your job is to review what they do. Your job is to protect the American people from a tyrannical FBI storming the home of an American family.
I could not disagree more with your description of the FBI as tyrannical. And I
you don't believe it's tyrannical that FBI agents were a part of storming a father's home in suburban Philadelphia?
Mr. Chairman. Time of the gentleman's expired. The witness may respond, and then we'll move to our next witness.
Sir, respectfully, member. They did not storm his house. They came to his door. They knocked on his door and identified themselves. They asked him to exit. He did without incident. Whenever our agents, well, not at gunpoint, whenever our agents conduct an arrest, they are armed. Our agents are armed virtually all the time, as you may remember from your own experience as a prosecutor.
The gentleman yields back. The ranking member has a unanimous consent request.
I ask unanimous consent that this document be placed in the record.
That's not too
I ask unanimous
specific.
consent to enter the full January 15th, 2021 email thread between Bank of America and the FBI that is about threats to Inauguration Day instead of the edited version that was shown on the screen earlier.
I'm happy to have that into the record. Without objection, we champion that. We're going to bring that up again here if we get a chance. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, good to see you. I thank you for being here today. And I just want to remind those who are watching at home or here in the room that we are here as an oversight function. We are not here as a political tool to hammer you or your 38,000 public servants, law enforcement men and women, and to try to use you politically. But it surely doesn't feel that way all the time during this. So I thank you for your service. I thank the men and women for their service. I have a first cousin, technically I guess a first cousin-in-law, who for a very long time in the Philadelphia suburbs served as an FBI agent with integrity and honor. So I think of him, I think of Jack today as I'm doing this. I read your testimony often, over and over. You state the mission of FBI to protect the American people and uphold the Constitution of the United States. Twofold. Protect the American people, uphold the Constitution. Do it by the rule of law. That's what we should be asking about. Are we doing that to the best of our ability? I want to use and examine the case of the Mar-a-Lago documents because it's been used by the former president as a pitying moment, as though he has somehow been victimized, but none of that is normal. These are serious times, and your people have serious missions about the safety of the American people and doing it lawfully. Director Wray, a ballroom, a bathroom, a bedroom, are those appropriate places to store classified, confidential information?
Well, again, I don't want to be commenting on the pending case, but I will say that there are specific rules about where to store classified information and that those need to be stored in a SCIF, a secure compartmentalized information facility. And in my experience, ballrooms, bathrooms, and bedrooms are not SCIFs.
Mine too. And yet that is where the former president chose to put vital information about our national security. He exacerbated the risk, as alleged in the damning 37-count indictment, by evading law enforcement and allegedly even showing some of these classified documents to others who were not either in a SCIF or up to having these informations sent to him. It was January 20th, having lost the election, 2021, when at noon, Mr. Trump had to leave the White House. And of course, it's shown in the affidavit and in the indictment that he left with quite a few boxes. May of 2021, the National Archives emailed requesting the missing documents from Mr. Trump. His lawyer said that he would provide them and then never did. January 18 of 2022, so we're talking a full year later, Mr. Trump finally turned over 15 boxes. 14 of them contained documents with classified markings, 30 documents top secret. June 2022, this is now a year and a half later, DOJ and FBI recover an additional 38 classified documents from Mar-a-Lago, your FBI, our FBI. A lawyer for Mr. Trump signed a statement at that point. To the best of her knowledge, she said all classified materials had been returned. But surveillance footage, of course, showed that wasn't the case. And in August of 2022, a federal judge approved a warrant to search Mar-a-Lago. This was not a raid, as some on the other side would like to have a pity party for Mr. Trump. This was not a raid. They then retrieved another 102 documents with classified markings. 300 and some documents taken by the president, improperly stored, and then tried to evade and obstruct justice, as is alleged. Do you think that the FBI went over the top or was out of line in your participation in retrieving these documents?
Well, again, I don't want to discuss the specifics of a pending case, but from everything I've seen, our folks in this case have proceeded honorably and in strict compliance with our policies, our rules, and our best practices.
And it seems from what overview we can do, I'm taking a look here at the affidavit to get the search warrant to go on in. It was one of your special agents assigned from the Washington field office. Obviously, we don't know who, but pointed out and made the case for probable cause to go in and to collect these documents. So let's take a look at the flip side. What's the harm? What's the danger to either human assets, your employees, national security for Mr. Trump holding on to, moving around, showing top secret documents? Where's the harm? 18 months of this going on.
Well, again, respectfully, I'm not going to comment or weigh in on a case that's now pending in front of federal judges, but speaking more generally, the rules governing the handling of classified information are there for a reason, and people need to be very mindful of those rules. And unfortunately, the FBI has, as a steady part of its docket, a number of investigations involving mishandling. And the reason those rules are there is because classified information, if it gets into the wrong hands, can put human sources in jeopardy. It can put other kinds of intelligence collection at jeopardy. It can jeopardize our partnerships with foreign liaison services, which are really the lifeblood of the intelligence community in many ways. So it's serious business, and it needs to be taken seriously. But again, I'm not speaking about a particular case. I'm
I-
just speaking generally.
I very much appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, but I do want to just point out to the world, none of this is normal. It was not normal what took place here. And I yield back.
Generally, yields back. Bedroom, bathroom, ballroom? How about a box in a
Mr.
garage?
Chairman,
A
Mr.
beach
Chairman.
house in Delaware and the Biden Center. I don't think those are skips
Mr. Chairman,
either.
point of order.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk about China, but before I do, I want to just comment, in the last exchange with Mr. Roy, I heard you say certain practices were outrageous to you, and I appreciated that. And I think maybe we would have liked to have heard more of that this hearing, about things, acknowledging failures. I realize there are a lot of positives to talk about, but we do, as a committee, want to work with you. When Chairman Jordan asked why so much is redacted in a document, could we perhaps sit down with you, even if it's privately, and you tell us why that needs to be the case? If we ask for the names of these employees that were behind the Catholic issue in Virginia, can we get a commitment that we'll eventually get those names? I didn't hear that in that exchange with Mr. Jordan.
Well, you certainly have my commitment that we will work collaboratively with the committee. We obviously have rules that govern what we can share, and we have to be mindful of those too. But in my experience, that's what the longstanding accommodation process between the executive branch, especially law enforcement agencies, and Congress is there for. And we absolutely will pursue that in good faith. I know we've been providing an enormous amount of information, and if there are places that we can do better on that, we want to try to do better on that, if, again, consistent with our rules. I'm very mindful of the fact that the whole reason I'm in this job is because my predecessor was fired, and in a fairly scathing Inspector General report, one of the things he was criticized for was sharing more information, both with the public and, frankly, with Congress, than was consistent with federal rules.
Thank you. Thank you for that pledge. Now to China. Most Americans don't realize, I don't think, that U.S. companies doing business in China are required to have joint venture agreements. That's been around since 2017 or 18, I believe. And it requires the Chinese Communist Party to have political cells within these enterprises, American enterprises in China. In the last few weeks, it has come to my attention that they've taken that up a notch and actually gone further, the Chinese have, and said that not only must they be present and have access, but they now control these American businesses. So they're, in essence, nationalizing American enterprises in China. And the CEOs I've talked to are afraid to say something. They say they've come to the FBI. The FBI, I think, is aware of this. I'm about to turn it over to you. My question is this happening, and what can be done about it? What do we need to do about it?
Well, I think you've put your finger on a very important issue, and frankly, one that does not get the attention that it really deserves. So I appreciate you bringing it up. I will say that, in my view, there is no country, none, that presents a broader, more comprehensive threat to our ideas, our innovation, our economic security than the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. And in many ways, it represents, I think, the defining threat of our era. And when it comes specifically to the business community, while there's no law against joint ventures, the problem that we have is that the Chinese government all too often has exploited those joint ventures to then use them as ways to get improper access to companies' secrets and information.
Do you find that they have stepped it up, though, to where they are, in essence, nationalizing U.S. companies quietly?
In a variety of ways. I hadn't really thought of using that term, but I think you're onto a very important point. I'll give you an example that I think a lot of people in America still don't know about and would be shocked to hear, which is that really any company of any size in China is required by Chinese law to have what they quaintly call a committee, which is essentially a cell inside the company whose sole function is to ensure that company's compliance with Chinese Communist Party orthodoxy. If we tried to install something like that in American companies, or if the British tried to do it in British companies or any number of other places, people would go out of their minds, and rightly so.
Agreed. Well, thank you. I'd like to work with you more on that, and I'd yield the balance of my time to the chairman. Thank you.
But that's exactly what you did. And the judge said it last week. Every week you were meeting with big tech companies saying, hey, look at this. This violates your policy. Take this speech of Americans down. You were doing the same darn thing you just described the Chinese about. And can we put up the email that Mr. Nadler entered in the unanimous consent request? Can we put this up from the FBI to Bank of America? Because I want to know something. This is the full email. Go to the bullet point where it says, any historical purchase going back 6 months generally for weapons-related vendor purchase. You see that, Director? You see that bullet point? The one that says any in all caps, that bullet point? This is the email. How did you know? How would you know if it's a firearm purchase? How is the FBI going to know this? Put your mic on, please.
I'm sorry. I'm not going to start engaging on specific correspondence. I don't have the whole string here. As I've said before, my understanding is that our engagement with Bank of America was lawful, but that we also took steps, as we discussed in our earlier exchange.
Well, if it's lawful, why'd you take steps not to use the material? You can't have it both ways.
I disagree with that, actually.
Really?
There are plenty of things that we lawfully can do that we decide are better not to do, and that's my understanding is what happened here.
Wow. Wow. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, thank you for your testimony and thank you for your public service. Last week in my district and my hometown of El Paso, Texas, a domestic violent extremist was sentenced to 90 consecutive life terms for a horrific attack he carried out on my community on August 3rd, 2019. On that day, he confessed that he drove over 10 hours from his community in East Texas to mine in order to slaughter Mexicans and immigrants. And before he walked into that Walmart, he published his screed online, and he used some of the same ugly xenophobic rhetoric that I hear my colleagues on the other side of the aisle use. And then he walked into that Walmart with an automatic style weapon and began shooting indiscriminately. He killed 23 people, injured dozens more, and my community remains profoundly impacted by that attack. And the victims and the survivors and the loved ones still live with profound pain and trauma. What is the FBI doing, Director Wray, in response to racially motivated domestic terrorism?
Well, first, let me say I feel your pain. I actually visited the Walmart crime scene shortly after the attack and spent time with our folks on the ground who were processing the crime scene in blistering heat in the parking lot there. And obviously got briefed by the investigative team and met with our local partners. And obviously it was a horrific, tragic event. And the individual stories about some of the individual victims stick with me to this day. As to the broader phenomenon of racially motivated violent extremism, we have done a number of things. We elevated it to a national threat priority back in the summer of 2019, I believe it was, which means that it is squarely in scope of all of our joint terrorism task forces and treated as a priority at the top level. That's our highest level of priority. We also have engaged, we created a domestic terrorism hate crimes fusion cell, and you might wonder what's the point of that? Well, what we found was that sometimes the same acts of violence could either be called a hate crime or could be called an act of domestic violent extremism. And in the way the FBI is structured, the first is treated by our criminal investigative division, the second is is focused on by our counterterrorism division. And by bringing the two subject matter experts together, we could make sure that we are not letting anything slip through the cracks, and more importantly, we can be proactive in thinking ahead. And that same fusion cell, for example, was then very important in us identifying and preventing a potentially devastating attack against a synagogue outside of Colorado. It was really one of the first times in recent memory that a hate crimes prosecution was able to be preventative. All too often, unfortunately, those cases are brought after there's a horrific attack. So we were very proud of disrupting that plot.
Thank you so much, Director Wray. I'm also very curious about what steps you've taken to improve coordination between the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security in terms of reporting the domestic terrorism data.
Well, there were a number of places. This gets a little bit technical, but the reports that that Congress called for. I've had a number of engagements with Senator Peters and on the Senate side about this, where data about how many domestic terrorism attacks there had been and which cases there were. I think there were different ways in which the two agencies were what they were counting and so forth. So in order to kind of get better at providing that information as required by Congress, we've worked more and more closely with DHS on ensuring a common set of metrics and so forth to make sure that the reports are getting in on time and that they're complete. We still have some work to do to make them better, but I think we've made significant progress.
I appreciate it. That data is critically important, as you know. I'm just about out of time. Thanks again for your service, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Excuse me, gentlelady yields back. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Good afternoon, Director Wray. Director, how many sworn special agents are there currently in the United States?
You mean outside the FBI?
Oh, no, in the FBI.
Just in the FBI? I think we have about 14,000 or so FBI special agents.
And they are spread across field offices and resident agencies in the U.S. and in some cases around the world. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. Now, as a former federal prosecutor and judge, I've had the opportunity to work with a number of men and women of the FBI from my home state. And one thing that I know and that we've heard in your testimony today is that you all have very broad responsibilities. Is it correct to say that the FBI, among other things, investigates counterterrorism, counterintelligence, cybercrime, public corruption, civil rights offenses, transnational organized crime, violent crime, and domestic terrorism?
And then other things as well,
Yes.
but yes.
Yes. And in addition to that, would you agree with the statement that the Bureau provides important support to local law enforcement agencies around the country on those subjects and others?
I would say indispensable support, and something I hear about. I'm talking with chiefs and sheriffs probably every week in this job since I've started, and if there's one refrain I hear from them consistently is keep it coming, we need it, can you give us even more help? That's what I hear from them.
Now, I'd like to focus on the subject of domestic terrorism today. And when we talk about domestic terrorism, the Bureau's work includes investigating and bringing to justice those who would do profound harm to the homeland given the opportunity. And the Bureau has been involved in cases involving hate crimes, violent extremists, and even some of our country's most notorious criminals like Timothy McVeigh and Ted Kaczynski. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and of course there are many such individuals who have plans to do harm to our homeland that America never hears about because you successfully intercept and prevent before those incidents occur.
Yes, in fact, one of the things that I think people would be surprised to know, because terrorism is not as much in the news as it was during the era when I was serving in the Bush administration in the 9/11 era, but we have, just since I've been director, disrupted attacks against a July 4th parade in Ohio, any number of attacks against churches and other houses of worship, an attempted attack, a plot to attack a hospital during COVID, the pier in San Francisco in sort of a peak tourism moment, a crowded beach during Memorial Holiday, and these are not all domestic terrorism. Some of them are, and that's important for people to know, some of these are jihadist-inspired terrorist attacks too, and that has not gone away, even though a lot of the public discussion has been about domestic terrorism.
And so here's what I'm hoping you can help us reconcile today. So we know that there are a limited number of agents, a limited number of resources, and a vast responsibility to prevent a broad array of very serious offenses. And what I'd like to do with that in mind is turn your attention to the decision within the Bureau to use investigative resources to investigate and surveil parents who attended school board meetings for the purpose of sharing their concerns about the nature of their children's education and the efficacy of the policies that were being implemented by school boards around the country. Is it correct that in 2021, the FBI created a threat tag specifically designed to identify parents attending school board meetings?
Yes, but I think it's important for people to understand what a threat tag is and is not. It is not what we base investigations on. It's not an investigative tool. It's an administrative function in our system, and it doesn't change anything about how we investigate, tools we use, any of our longstanding standards for predication.
But in those
and you mentioned the whole
circumstances-
resource allocation question.
It is correct, is it not, however, that agents surveilled, that agents did in fact surveil and investigate certain parents who were attending school board meetings?
No, ma'am, that's actually not correct. We opened 25 assessments into reports that were tagged, but none of those involved incidents at school board meetings. And to my knowledge, the FBI has not opened investigations on any parent for exercising speech at school board meetings.
Would you be concerned that to do so would be an infringement or perhaps a chilling on the First Amendment rights of parents to participate freely and openly in those meetings? Do you believe that would be an appropriate function of the Bureau?
I believe that our mission is to protect the American people and uphold the Constitution. And the uphold the Constitution part is very important to me and to our people. And I will say to you the same thing I said to all 56 of our field offices as soon as I read that memo, which is the FBI is not and has never been in the business of policing or investigating speech by parents at school board meetings, and we're not about to start now. We're going to keep doing what we've been doing, and that includes when there's violence, threats of violence, we're going to work with our state and local partners, as we always have on that, and following our normal procedures and our normal investigative steps and our normal standards for predication.
Thank you, Director Wray. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
And the lady yields back. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, thank you for being here. Thank you for your testimony, and thank you for your service to our country under some pretty difficult circumstances, and we're certainly grateful. I'm certainly grateful. The people of the state that I represent, Colorado, are grateful to the 38,000 members of the FBI team, as you have articulated, that are working every day to keep the American people safe and to keep the people of my state and my community safe. So we're grateful for you being here. This committee obviously has a legitimate role in terms of conducting oversight. Generally, that oversight has extended to the policy areas, the areas of law enforcement that, of course, you are responsible for. Unfortunately, much of the conversation today, and it's disappointing, I think, for those Americans who have been watching, has not been focused on those legitimate areas of inquiry, but instead conspiracy theories and the like. Obviously, as you have been given an opportunity to respond to some of the attacks that have been made against the law enforcement agency that you direct, and the dangerous calls, or at least in my view, the dangerous calls that have been made by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle in terms of defunding federal law enforcement, which is deeply dangerous, and you've articulated the many reasons why. I'd like to focus in on two areas that are important to my constituents in Colorado and that I believe are relevant to the work that you do, and that is the fentanyl epidemic and gun violence prevention. With respect to the latter, you may recall you testified in front of the committee previously. I had an opportunity to ask you about an incident that occurred back in 2020 in my state in Colorado. In 2021, the GAO issued a report in response to this particular incident. Just by way of background, a gun dealer in Colorado transferred a firearm to an 18-year-old resident of Florida without first verifying the purchaser's age, eligibility, and her state of residence. The gun buyer then threatened to commit a school shooting akin to the mass tragedy that occurred at Columbine High, causing the lockdown and closure of multiple schools in my district back in Colorado. The report recommended, the GAO report, that the FBI strengthen its system for the sale of firearms to out-of-state purchasers. Specifically, it recommended that the FBI update the NICS system to verify the age requirements of an out-of-state firearm purchaser in both the purchaser's state of residence and the state of sale to ensure basic age eligibility. And we've introduced legislation that I believe the Department of Justice is aware of to make that requirement statutory. Wonder if you could expound a bit on whether I'm sure you're aware of the report, whether the FBI has implemented the recommendation that the GAO has made, and if not, the FBI's plans to do so?
Well, I think the specific legislation that would require that is something, as you said, that I think the department is studying, and so I can't weigh in on a specific legislative proposal. When it comes to the specific issue of 18 to 20-year-olds in particular, and gun purchases, that is, of course, the subject of the bipartisan Safer Communities Act that was passed. And there are a number of significant checks that now occur. We started implementing that last October, fully implemented it starting in January. And that provides for enhanced checks for that critical population, the 18 to 20-year-old range, juvenile criminal records, mental health records for that population, and contact, in some ways, most importantly, contact with local law enforcement in that person's community. And I've actually been out to NICS, met with and sat with the operators who process those checks. So I've seen kind of firsthand how it works and the important work it represents. And I think if you were to talk, I'm talking to chiefs and sheriffs all over this country every week, and you will hear from most of them, if you talk to them for very long, you will hear about their concern and our concern about juveniles and violence. Almost guarantee you within the first 10 minutes of any conversation. It's a real problem in this country.
Well, I thank you for your answer, and I think it underscores the importance of the NICS program, and would look forward to perhaps following up with your team on this particular administrative issue of trying to just make sure that the database is working efficiently. Limited time left, but I just want to give you an opportunity. I know we've talked a bit about the fentanyl epidemic devastating communities across the country, certainly in Colorado. It's one of the reasons why we created a fentanyl prevention caucus here in the Congress. It's bipartisan. Representative Issa is one of our co-chairs. Wonder if you just might be able to, for those Americans who are watching, kind of provide us with your sense of some of the trends, the most dangerous and disturbing trends that you think the American people and policymakers should be aware of.
Well, I will say there are a whole bunch of trends, but in the limited time, but because of the importance of this topic, I'll hit a couple. One is, and we were just discussing this recently internally, we are finding over the course of the last year that, maybe even a little less than a year, that almost every gang takedown we have now, and we're doing them all over the country all the time, almost every single one now seems to involve as well a seizure of fentanyl. And we've been doing gang takedowns since Congresswoman Lee was a prosecutor as well. So that's not new, but what is new is that over and over and over again, it seems consistently we're finding fentanyl in these, again, these are violent crime takedowns. The second phenomenon, which is deeply disturbing, and I know the DEA administrator is very concerned about as well, is that we're seeing more and more adulteration or lacing of fentanyl into all sorts of different kinds of prescription drugs that lots of Americans take all the time. And if you think about the phenomenon of the youth of this country, which is itself a problem of getting prescription drugs from their friends or their friends' parents or whatever it happens to be, they may not know that there's potentially a lethal dose of fentanyl in some prescription drug that they're taking. So it just underscores the importance of only getting your prescriptions from an appropriate medical provider.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Is the southern border secure?
I think the southern border represents a massive security threat.
So what we've heard from you today is that fentanyl has become a really big problem and that you're having to put more resources to it. Is that correct?
Towards fentanyl, yes. Yes, we are.
And the related gangs. I mean, you just retailed some of the story.
Right.
So this all happened over the last couple years as the border has become unsecure. Is the southern border secure?
Well, again, we're not, I want to defer to the Homeland Security, which is responsible for the physical security of the building. I will just tell you from the FBI's perspective that we are seeing all sorts of very serious criminal threats that come from across the border.
And getting worse, correct? You're putting more assets towards it?
We certainly do. We have, as I said...
So it's becoming more of a priority for you?
It is becoming more and more of a priority for us, yes.
So in the Durham report, and we heard from Mr. Durham just a couple weeks ago, he said the FBI failed to uphold the important mission of strict fidelity to the law, and that predates you. Do you agree with that statement that Mr. Durham made?
Yes, I do.
Was Russia collusion a hoax? So, in light of the Durham report and that, was Russia collusion a hoax?
What I would say is this. One as to the Durham report itself, and one as to the issue of Russia malign influence. As to the Durham report itself,
be quick.
I will try. The conduct it describes is conduct that I consider unacceptable and unrepresentative of who I see the FBI as every day and must not ever be allowed to happen again.
And on the other side?
Second, on the other one, it is not seriously disputed that the Russians, among other foreign adversaries, have attempted to interfere in our elections. And there have been any number of findings to that. In fact, President Trump himself rightly declared a national emergency about foreign interference in our elections in 2018.
So as a result of the actions of James Comey, the disgraced James Comey, and the FBI, they've interfered with the elections in both 2016 and 2020. Will that interference happen again in 2024 by the FBI?
The FBI is not going to be interfering in elections.
They did in 2016.
Well, I don't know that that's what Mr. Durham found. What I would tell you again is that it was conduct that I consider unacceptable and unrepresentative.
You can be in denial if you want to.
I'm not in denial,
Mr. Director,
sir.
you can be in denial on this. That's exactly what happened. Last year, the FBI gave a defensive briefing to my home state Senator Johnson, and you can see the slide up there now. And then that defensive briefing was leaked to the Washington Post. Who ordered that briefing?
So defensive briefings, when it comes to election matters, including in the last administration, under a procedure set up by the last administration, are an interagency process coordinated by the Office of Director of National Intelligence. And the way that works is the interagency concludes that a defensive briefing is appropriate, and the FBI is given information from whatever intelligence community agency supplies it, and then we provide it. Defensive briefings, it's important to understand.
Senator Johnson, that's his quote. He's up there with you and Hunter Biden. I knew it was a setup. And he asked you this question back in November of last year, and he said, I knew it was a setup. And that goes back to the point about interfering in elections. Senator Johnson was one of the most vulnerable Republican incumbents, if not the most vulnerable Republican incumbent, that was a target of the Democrats in the 2022 election. And then you see this briefing happen, and he knew what was happening, that there was someone or some people within the FBI and the intelligence arena that were going after him. Did Joe Biden take payments from Burisma or any other foreign companies as vice president, president, or private citizen Biden?
As you may know, there is an ongoing investigation being led by the U.S. Attorney in Delaware, Mr. Weiss, appointed by President Trump in the last administration, that our Baltimore field office is working with, and I would refer you to him as to what, if anything, can be shared.
So the president is under investigation.
I'm not going to confirm or speak to who is or isn't under investigation for what. I'm simply going to tell you.
So he's not under investigation?
I didn't say that either. By longstanding department policy and practice, I'm not going to be confirming or denying who is or isn't under investigation or for what.
Thank you. I'll close with this. Russia collusion started it, Mr. Chairman, and the targeting and the suppression and the censorship has continued until this point. We need to thoroughly review what the FBI is doing, and at a minimum, I will be allowing FISA to sunset if we're not going to see significant reforms in the agency. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Wray, for your service and your patience. In 2018, 10 leaders of Temple Beth Or, a synagogue in my district, received threats mailed to their homes. These threats led to the cancellation of programming and continued a disturbing trend of rising anti-Semitism in North Carolina. In the years since, my state has confronted new threats from domestic terrorists at minority institutions. This past April, a man was arrested on the campus of North Carolina A&T State University, the largest HBCU in the country, with multiple firearms and hundreds of rounds of ammunition, as well as a makeshift explosive, brass knuckles, crossbow, knives, and other weapons. Thankfully, this man was arrested before he could cause any harm, but the threat he posed to the campus mirrors threats we've seen to HBCUs around the country. In North Carolina and across the United States, we've also seen increased threats against reproductive care providers in the wake of the Dobbs decision last summer. And North Carolina recently enacted a 12-week abortion ban that has severely restricted access to reproductive health care in my state, and people often have to go through threatening crowds to be able to access the care that they need. While some in North Carolina have highlighted vandalism of crisis pregnancy centers since the overturn of Roe, they failed to acknowledge or respond to the increase in violence at abortion providers. Does the FBI currently provide anti-terrorism training to civilians, to HBCUs, places of worship, religious centers, individuals providing abortion services, LGBTQ groups, and does that training include a domestic terrorism component so that they can help you and law enforcement?
Well, we do a whole bunch of things to engage with the community, institutions that are targeted with violence, that include a number of the kinds of institutions you mentioned. I know in particular we work very, very closely with the Jewish community, which has the unfortunate distinction of, despite the percentage that they represent of the American population, of being way disproportionately targeted. So we spend a lot of time engaging with them around the country and nationally. We also spent a lot of time engaging with campus law enforcement, including at HBCUs. We spent a lot of time on that, especially last year with the bomb threats that were coming in. I was just recently with all of the campus law enforcement leaders from around the country just the last couple of weeks. And we certainly try to provide awareness to different kinds of institutions about how to deal with potential mass casualty events and things like that. We also provide information about things to be on the lookout for in people's communities. I should say, though, when you mention on the abortion side, reproductive facilities, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't also point out that there has been a pretty significant uptick in violence going the other way since the Dobbs decision. And in fact, most of the investigations that we've opened since the Dobbs decision, probably about 70% of them have been violence against pro-life facilities. We recently had a significant charge in the Madison, Wisconsin area of a guy who was trying to firebomb a pro-life facility there. So we're out there with communities across the spectrum.
Okay. And how would an investigation differ if it's domestic terrorism as opposed to just an ordinary criminal case?
Well, our investigation focuses on the violence first and foremost. I think there is no domestic terrorism statute. There's no offense of domestic terrorism, but we define domestic terrorism for purposes of opening an investigation as having three things: violence or threat of violence, in furtherance of an ideology. In other words, that's what's driving the violence in that particular instance, and in violation of federal criminal law. If we have those three things, enough evidence to indicate that that might be what's going on, then we would treat that as a domestic terrorism investigation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Lady yields back. We got votes, Director. We're going to do one more on our side, then we'll take a break and come back for the remaining members. The gentlelady from Wyoming is recognized.
Yes, Director Wray, we have established that the FBI and other federal agencies met weekly with executives from major social media companies, including Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Google, Microsoft, LinkedIn, and Yahoo and Verizon. Were you involved in any of those meetings, yes or no?
I wasn't involved in the kind of meetings that you're talking about, or I didn't participate, I guess, in meetings like that.
Okay. Are these meetings still occurring, and if so, how frequently?
Well, right now, as you may know, there is a preliminary injunction that's been entered.
Prior to the preliminary injunction, were these weekly meetings taking place?
I don't know if weekly meetings occurred, again, before the injunction, but certainly we've been very open about this, engaged with social media companies.
Does the FBI intend to continue to have such meetings leading up to the 2024 election to police election-related speech?
Well, we're not going to be policing election-related speech.
That's what you previously did.
I do not agree with that description.
Okay, well, here's what
I
I would say. This committee has learned that the FBI acted to, quote, discredit leaked information about Hunter Biden before and after it was published, that, quote, Twitter's contact with the FBI was constant and pervasive, and as if it were a subsidiary, and that, quote, a surprisingly high number are requests by the FBI for Twitter to take action on election misinformation, even involving joke tweets from low follower accounts. Are you aware that that has been reported?
I am aware of some of what the committee has found in its
Okay.
report. But I will add that I'm not sure I agree with the findings.
But that's what we found. Director Wray, you and I both know that the federal government is forbidden from doing indirectly what it cannot do directly. In other words, neither you nor the FBI have any legal authority to circumvent the First Amendment by using a surrogate to do your dirty work. Yet that is exactly what you have been doing. The Bureau, under your watch, has been using proxies to violate the First Amendment. Were you the person who gave the orders to use these social media companies to violate violate Americans' First Amendment rights?
Again, I don't agree with your description of our engagement with social media companies.
So who made the decision to use social media companies as a proxy to suppress the First Amendment rights of American citizens?
Because I don't believe that's what we did, I'm not sure there's anyone that would have made such a decision.
Do you really expect the American public to believe that you were not involved in the decisions related to using social media companies to suppress the First Amendment rights of American citizens?
I can't help what people will believe or not. I can only speak to what the facts are.
Was anyone ever fired or otherwise reprimanded for pursuing mass censorship? In other words, has anybody been held accountable for taking the actions that were described in the decision by the district court out of Louisiana?
Well, the district court's decision just came out on July 4th.
Has anybody been reprimanded or held accountable?
And at the moment, we have issued guidance to everyone in the organization who could be affected as to how to follow that.
Has anyone been reprimanded?
I'm not going to speak to personnel matters because we have not made any such determination at this stage.
Mr. Wray, I have some letters from Lindsey Graham and Rand Paul that were sent to you on April 20th and June 20th requesting a meeting to discuss the Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate's work investigating the origins of SARS COVID-19. Your office has never responded to these letters. Do you intend to respond to Senators Lindsey Graham and Rand Paul to find out more information about the origin of COVID-19?
Well, we try hard to respond to all correspondence we get from the Hill. We get a lot.
I assume you'll be responding to
my
this.
intention is that we would have an appropriate response. Sometimes our responses, by longstanding procedure, our responses have to go through the department before they go out, so it could be that it's held up there, but I don't know that that's... I don't know if that's the case in these particular ones.
Senators Graham and Paul should be receiving a response from your office pretty soon.
Some kind of response. As you may know, we were the only agency in the intelligence community until more recently when the Department of Energy did as well to reach the assessment that in our folks' view, we thought it was more likely to be a lab leak.
Okay. Mr. Wray, from the Twitter files, Missouri versus Biden disclosures, the Durham investigation and report, and exposure and collapse of the Russian collusion hoax, the American people fully understand that there is a two-tier justice system that has been weaponized to persecute people based on their political beliefs, and that you have personally worked to weaponize the FBI against conservatives. I asked Mr. Durham about this, to which he answered, "I don't think that things can go too much further with the view that law enforcement, particularly the FBI or Department of Justice, runs a two-tiered system of justice. The nation can't stand under those circumstances." Director Wray, what are you prepared to do to reform federal law enforcement in a manner which earns back the trust of the American people?
Well, first off, I would disagree with your characterization of the FBI and certainly your description of my own approach. The idea that I'm biased against conservatives seems somewhat insane to me, given my own personal background. As to how we are approaching our work of protecting the American people and upholding the Constitution, it starts with me having emphasized to all of our folks over and over and over again in everything we do that we need to do the right thing in the right way, and that means following the facts wherever they lead, no matter who likes it. It starts, then goes on from there to all kinds of enhanced procedures, safeguards, approvals, double checks, triple checks, record-keeping requirement, accountability policies, the funding of new functions like an Office of Internal Audit that didn't exist before, the installation of an entirely new leadership team from my predecessor, and where I can take action, where we can take action to hold people accountable by removing people from the chain of command.
Gentlelady's time has
referring
expired,
people-
Director. We're going to take a 30-minute break for votes. We will be back. I'm going to try to start right at 2:15.
Unanimous consent to introduce
Without
to
objections.
the record.
Without objection, so be entered. We'll start with Ms. Bush and then Mr. Bishop on our side when we return. We'll stand in recess for approximately 30 minutes.